At this point in time, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Kelly Northridge, the managing partner of the Audacity Institute and the Audacity Fund, where she works directly with underrepresented founders to bring them resources, which helps them meet, build and thrive a financially successful business. She has a background in finance, including venture capital, mergers and acquisitions, economic impact, and international strategy, change management, and organizational development. She holds a Bachelor of Science in International Business and Economics from UNR, an MBA from Cornell, a Master's in Public Health from UCLA, and her doctorate from the University of Oxford, focusing on investing for inclusion. To lead us in the funding portion, please help me welcome Dr. Kelly Northridge.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction. I greatly appreciate it. I realized I just hit the wrong button, so hopefully you're able to see a presentation that has popped up. Today, we are delighted to talk to you about funding your business. We have the way that we're going to approach our time together is I'm actually going to walk through an overview of funding, and then we're going to invite our panelists on to talk through a few different funding mechanisms, and then we're going to open it up to all of you for question and answer. So first, I thought I would begin with this beautiful picture of the entrepreneur's journey. This is what we all see as the way a company should be built. It's beautifully straight up and on this wonderful path. However, any of us who are building companies know that's not the case at all. It actually looks like this. It goes up, it goes down, it goes back, it goes forth, it bumps, and every once in a while, we actually move forward. When we are talking about money, it is no different. We are told that it is a beautiful upward journey for our funding journey. However, in actuality, it looks like this. It is a massive roller coaster. Again, we go up, we go down. Sometimes we flip upside down, and all we're trying to do is to stay on that track. There's a few stats about that roller coaster. 60% of businesses start with less than $25,000. A third start with less than $5,000. So that means most companies start with not much in the bank. However, regardless of how little we start with when we're building our companies, all companies have a funding strategy and a funding approach, which is what we're going to walk through today. So the first funding strategy I'd like to talk about, we're going to just talk about two simple strategies today, is bootstrapping, which is literally pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You fund yourself and others fund you essentially with that heart or love money. You're funding with your own money, you're funding with your profits, you're getting creative. You're minimizing your accounts receivable, you might be delaying payments, you're minimizing inventories, you're using those credit cards to the best of your ability, despite maybe you shouldn't be doing that at certain times, but that's how we're getting by. It all is done with creativity and a lot of sweat. And then occasionally we dip into our community and we do different options for crowdfunding. There are several large companies that we all know about who had a bootstrapping funding strategy. Spanx, GoPro, eBay, Basecamp, and Mochi. There is another approach that we would also like to consider as we're having our conversations today, which is a venture capital approach. This is an approach of high growth, where we push very hard to sell or exit fast out of our company. Essentially, in this scenario and this strategy, we're funding our business with other people's money. And these are two of the approaches that usually consider this. And I will dive into these in just a moment of unicorn and startups. But here are some venture capital model successes all of us are familiar with: Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, and SpaceX. So what do we need to think about as entrepreneurs when we are considering what funding approach we want to take? So I showed you that unicorn, and I'm going to show you the opposite of that, a zebra. So as we are building our companies, we need to think, do I want to be a unicorn company? What that means is, do I want to grow as fast as possible, literally at any cost, to build my company to a huge number in terms of its value and then sell it as quick as I can? Or do I want to be a zebra company? The zebra company approaches their companies in a way that is focused on sustainable growth for the company and the community at large. Another consideration when we're thinking about our funding approaches is what type of business we are. Are we a Main Street business or a high-tech business? And then also, what kind of money do we actually want? Do we want patient capital that stays with us on our journey? Or do we want that high growth capital that is going to help us grow as fast as possible? So once we have looked at our funding strategy, we then need to think about funding approaches that are available to us. There are actually 7 types of funding approaches that we're going to walk through now. When thinking of these funding approaches, we actually only have 2 investment categories from our friends at the IRS. There is debt and there is equity. With our debt and our equity, there are 3 types of each of them. There's a standard approach, there's convertible approaches, and there are alternative approaches. So we'll start with the first approach, which is standard debt. And how that works is we sign a promissory note. We get some cash, which is very exciting, but then we have to repay the loan. When we do approach with our standard debt, our company does not have to have a value on it, which means we don't say my company is worth $1 million. With a loan, we do have a set repayment period. So we know what we're paying. We have a predetermined interest rate. And on our books, for those who focus on their accounting, this is listed as a liability. So something that we owe that we have to pay back. This approach is used by all types of companies, and it can be looked at in different ways. Credit cards fit into this category. You might reach out to the SBA, you might look at the bank, and in certain circumstances, there might be some friendly angels that will loan you money on a standard debt approach. Next, we have standard equity. With standard equity, we sign a stock purchase agreement. The investor hands us over cash, and we give them in exchange a piece of our company. So we give them some stock or equity in our company. In order to do that, we actually have to put a value on our company. We have to say we are worth $1 million so that the investor can take a percent or a chunk of the company based on the money that they gave us. In this case, the investor does get ownership, and the investor needs to be bought out in order to make money for themselves. So we have to exit, they have to exit the company in some way. This could mean that we sell the company in order for them to be bought out. This could mean that we grow very large, very big, and become public company on the stock exchange. But those are the ideas of an exit. Next, we have convertibles. With convertibles, we can have a convertible debt or convertible equity. And what convertibles are is, again, we sign a convertible document. The investor hands us over money. And in this case, the word convertible means that we are making a promise for equity or convert to equity in the future. With these convertibles, the company is not valued yet. That's why it's a promise. What we're saying is right now, we don't know how much our company is worth. but in the future we will, and at that time we will convert you. With this, an investor will get ownership at some point. And in these types of instruments, the investor still needs an exit in order for them to make a return. Next, we have alternatives. Alternatives, one of the leading alternative investment approaches right now is called revenue-based financing. With revenue-based financing, you sign a revenue share agreement. The investor hands over cash, and together, the company and the investor make money. What happens with these is if it's an alternative debt, you are paying back the equivalent of your loan with a percent of your revenues. So if you have a bad month, think COVID, you would have a conversation with your investor and either your payment would be decreased for that month or possibly delayed, depending on the conversation that you have. So again, with this type of scenario, the company and the investor make money together. This does not require an exit for an investor to make a return. The payments, regardless of how it is set up in terms of our two approaches of debt or equity, when they are set up, the investor's return is baked in to that amount that you have to pay back over time. So because of that, these investments are most exciting to those companies that identify in the zebra space. Our last area that we consider is our customer or our community. So we can go to our customers in our community and approach crowdfunding in order to fund our businesses, or you can use your sales in order to grow your businesses. So putting these together, we have our two funding approaches and our types of funding. So with our bootstrapping, loans usually get us started off, whether that's credit cards or money from friends, and also from our community. Then we have an overlap. We do have some of that love money, as we call it, that branches and crosses over into our venture capital model, where people who are giving us some of that love money would like to actually have a piece of the company at some point. And then it also moves us into our investors, high growth angel investors, which, as we saw from the funding approaches, primarily means that they want to take a piece of the company at some point and are looking for an exit in order for them to get a return. So with that very quick overview, we actually would like to more focus on our panel discussion. And we have three fantastic panelists with us today to talk about a few of those funding approaches in more detail. So first, we have Mike O'Donnell, and he is formerly of the Colorado Lending Source. He just retired from there and has already started a wonderful journey with Prairie Rose Development. He has a distinguished career helping small businesses grow. He has served as the executive director of the University of Kansas Small Business Development Center, executive director of the Waukesha Valley Community Development Corporation in Kansas, and just recently stepped down from 20 years as the executive director of Colorado Lending Source. During 2019 alone, Colorado Lending Source facilitated 225 character-based loans to small business owners who created some 1,400 new jobs and had a $330 million impact on the US economy. Mike holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Melbourne and an MBA from the Australian Graduate School of Management at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. We also have joining us Jonny Price from WeFunder. Jonny is originally from the UK, where he started his career in strategy consulting with Oliver Wyman. In 2011, he joined the nonprofit Kiva.org as the founder and director of the US Lending Division, leading that team for 7 years. In early 2018, he joined WeFunder a public benefit corporation and B Corp, as Director of Business Development. His primary role is recruiting great companies that are excited to use crowdfunding to raise capital and gain customers. He serves on the Federal Reserve Board's Community Advisory Council and has a degree in history from the University of Cambridge. His proudest accomplishment is to be the dad of Felicity and Carlisle. And third on our panel, we have Danielle Rees of the Audacity Fund. Danielle brings her executive experience in startups and social ventures as CEO, CFO, CSO, and COO to support underrepresented founders as they build and grow their companies. She has co-founded 2 female-founded companies in the outdoor industry, BetsFit and Coalition Snow. Before devoting her energy to entrepreneurship, she dedicated 15 years to nonprofit management. She led Girls on the Run Sierras and Planned Parenthood through periods of tremendous growth. She has a bachelor's degree from Stanford and a master's in public health from UC Berkeley. She's an avid skier and mountain biker, and she loves the mountain lifestyle and thrives on the entrepreneurial energy. So thank you, panelists, for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you could please unmute, I want to make sure everyone's there. I'd actually like to start by having a conversation with Mike about character-based lending. So as we know, all startups start in bootstrapping mode, and for many that includes debt financing. And as we shared, we think of debt financing in terms of banks or credit cards, and usually that means credit checks and some frustrations as we go forward. So the reason that we invited Mike here today is to look at debt just a little bit differently and talk about character-based lending. And so, Mike, I hope you're with us.
Yes, thank you,
There you
Kelly.
are. Thank you. You were just over a bit on my screen. Lovely to see you.
Love you too. Thank you very much for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's nice to talk with you.
Thank you, Mike. My first question is, what is character-based lending?
And it's a good way to look at character-based lending in contrast to traditional or the lending that you're probably most used to. Even your previous speakers reminded me, if you think about how things used to be in the olden days with hemp and how things changed and how they're changing back again, there's a little bit of that with lending as well. Today, lending is primarily all based on collateral and credit. So if you're approaching a bank, or even if you're using a small business administration loan or a USDA guaranteed loan, it's basically a bank vehicle, although nonprofit lenders get involved as well too in many cases, but it's primarily focused on collateral and credit. In the olden days, we didn't really have credit scores, and back in those days, lenders would make loans to people based on who they were, what the community response was, a lot of things that were more intuitive or intrinsic, less structured, if you like. As we've moved, and especially the Small Business Administration since the last recession has moved entirely to credit scoring their small loans. But although credit scoring is a science, it's not an exact science. And because you need to have collateral and good credit to get access to capital from a bank using the 5 C's, 6 C's, 7 C's, character-based lending is just taking us back a little bit in time. And I'm old enough to remember when my dad had his business back in Australia, the way he would get loans from banks would be based on who he was and what his business was. And character-based lending is just a variation on that. It's making a loan to someone, not so much someone individually, but someone and their team, and essentially backing that person. They may not have a good credit score. That's not necessarily an eliminator of someone, because there are lots of reasons why people may not have scores. And in this current environment, I would suggest that a lot of people's scores will deteriorate over the next 12 months anyway. So character-based lending is just a variation on traditional lending without the preoccupation on credit and collateral, looking more at what I consider character and capacity. And so it's really just a contrast between those two systems. Again, it's not a science in the same way that looking at a credit score may or may not be, so it's not really mainstream and probably won't ever be, but definitely working with nonprofit lender organizations or people who are more interested in social impact investments, character-based lending is an option for people to explore should they have that option.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview. And as a business owner, especially during COVID, when you say that my credit can be terrible, I'm excited. I want to know more. Right? So why would an owner look at the character-based lending aside from the fact that we are not just looking at my credit score? Are there other bonuses to say? You mentioned nonprofits. Are there other bonuses to approaching organizations who use this type of approach?
There are many people who indicate that they might put more emphasis on character. Character is one of the important 5 C's of credit. And so banks will look at it, but from a banking perspective, they're interested in collateral, they're interested in capacity, and your capacity is your history. So what's been happening over the last, again, especially the last couple of decades, is because young businesses don't have a track record, because many millennial generations, may not get married as early as previous generations. Many millennials have student debt, which might impact their credit scores. They're not an attractive for a traditional regulator type lender. So in the nonprofit lending area, the mission-based nonprofits, as well as the community development financial institutions, they can choose to put more weight on the character and the capacity than they put on the credit and collateral. Although again, many of the CDFIs that I've run into in our part of the world really, won't lend to someone unless they've got a profitability, or they won't lend to someone unless they've got a house or car that they can put up. But that's the reason why we as a nation are seeing relatively fewer and fewer new small businesses every year. We talk about startups. About 3/4 of all startups are basically individuals starting businesses for themselves. And in many cases, they may not need much, if any, in terms of financing. I know Jonny will probably talk about, Kiva, and Kiva is something that I've encouraged a lot of people to do. It's a variation on character-based lending, but for a small amount of money, some businesses who have a social impact can really sort of access funds relatively inexpensively. As the business grows, you really need to look for other sources. And whether you have access to character-based lending or not, it's, again, you should try and get the least expensive source of capital you can to help you grow your business if you're looking at debt. And character-based lending is a way of perhaps providing capital to earlier stage businesses and can traditionally get it through the traditional means. So for the last 10 years at Colorado Lending Source, as we built our character-based lending program, 72% of the projects we financed were startups. And those were people who couldn't find any assistance anywhere else, because banks don't like to work with startups until they're 3 years old. It's that sort of approach. So it's really looking at where the least expensive source of capital is, and whether, if you can't explore it down these channels, continue to explore. But and I think one of your other questions is just be careful about some of the sort of hidden costs that might be associated with any sort of lender. But character-based lending should be very transparent.
Wonderful, thank you. And you mentioned that with character-based lending, you can go to character-based lenders a little earlier than you can with more traditional debt. So when should a company actually think about a character-based loan in terms of their growth? Is it at the very beginning, in the middle? When would be a great time to explore this type of option?
I think it's something that anyone who's starting a business needs to think forward in the business as to how they anticipate it growing or developing or rolling out over the next couple of years. And although that's going to be a guess initially from the start, you need to have in your head, and you probably do, but putting it down on paper so you can communicate that. A lot of businesses don't need financing, and a lot of businesses that can start through the bootstrapping process might never ever need to talk to financing. And a lot of people are very debt adverse, and that's definitely understandable, especially in this environment. So in terms of looking at where that might be, it's really what your needs are. And Kiva can help you with loans of up to $15,000. I mean, if you need $5,000 or $10,000, perhaps a Kiva is the best approach to look at. If you're looking for more substantial funds, and a Kauffman Foundation report says that if you're starting a business and hope to have employees, you'll typically need about $50,000 to get started. That might be a good place to look at, microloans or character-based versions of microloans. With a character-based loan, that there tends to be a higher touch type relationship. So many times there'll be a mentor perhaps involved or a group involved in working. And at Colorado Lending Source, we required for all of our loans for them to have applicants to have mentors. And so that provides a higher touch from outside, but also there was a higher touch from inside our organization as well too. So if businesses are indeed young or don't have that level of maturity or that support system that might come through working with another sort of accelerator, incubator or other type group, it could be really a resource for them to explore as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. I have a lot more questions, and I know we could probably spend the whole hour on this, but I'm going to shift gears for a moment and talk to Jonny about equity crowdfunding. So as we noted before, Jonny is with WeFunder, and they focus on equity crowdfunding. And so Jonny, first, a light question, although I know it's a deep question. What is equity crowdfunding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would actually call it investment crowdfunding, just because the vast majority of what we do on WeFunder is equity, but we also do debt as well, either simple loans with a fixed interest rate or a revenue share where investors are being paid back as a percentage of the founders' revenues. So investment crowdfunding. Basically the quick version is that until May 2016, when the SEC rolled out the regulations for the 2012 Jobs Act, really the only people that could invest in early stage companies were either accredited investors, millionaires and billionaires basically, or institutions like banks or VC firms. But in May 2016, the rollout of what's called regulation crowdfunding, which is what's called an SEC exemption, a way that startups can raise capital. Regulation crowdfunding did two really cool things. Firstly, it allows you to, as an entrepreneur who's raising capital, it allows you to promote your investment opportunity to the world. So previously, if you were raising through the Regulation D exemption, which is still how most startups raise capital today, you have to privately solicit investors. But through regulation crowdfunding, you can put it on Facebook, you can send an email blast to your customers, you can get on the WeFunder website and get in front of our 700,000 registered users. So that's the first thing, the ability to publicly promote your investment opportunity and raise capital through kind of a PR campaign, marketing, etc. And then the second big change was that rather than limiting the people that can invest in you to accredited investors, which is basically the richest 5% of the population, regulation crowdfunding enables you to raise capital from everyone, 100% of the population, unaccredited investors as well as accredited investors. And so the combination of those two things, plus the fact that you can now get in front of our network of investors and WeFunder that typically account for about a third of the raise, are just kind of helping startup founders to make it a little bit easier for them to raise capital. And so the average company on WeFunder raised about 350 grand. As I mentioned, mostly equity, but some debt. The average investment amount is $1,000. So you might typically raise, from 350 investors investing $1,000 each for 350 grand. And so what we're trying to do is just get more capital flowing to startups throughout America, especially geographies that aren't San Francisco and New York and Boston, especially to underrepresented founders. We'd love to get more capital flowing to rural founders. And then on the investor side as well, for me, like, why should it be the case that only the wealthy get to invest in cool startups, that they love, or the founder of which they trust, or, the independent coffee shop in their community? Because we do Main Street businesses as well as tech startups. So that's pretty un-American, I think, which I say that as a Brit. You've got the Australian and the Brit telling you Americans what to do about saving entrepreneurship. This is deeply ironic, but that's actually why our founders started WeFunder and why we have this public benefit corporation charter. We talk about saving the American dream on our website. Why should only rich people get to invest in cool startups? Very un-American. So we're trying to democratize investing and thereby get more capital flowing to founders.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of those insights and information about that. And wanted to ask a very simple question in the sense of this sounds amazing.
Well, I think so.
How is WeFunder I've heard the word crowdfunding before, but you just threw out a whole bunch of stuff I've never heard of you can do with crowdfunding. How is WeFunder on the simplest level different than Kickstarter and GoFundMe?
Yeah, that's a good point. So there are various flavors of crowdfunding, right? And so as Mike mentioned, and I loved every word that Mike said, I've, for the last 10 years of my career, dedicated myself to kind of, character-based lending. I call it social underwriting at Kiva, trying to look beyond the credit score and thereby, get more capital flowing to entrepreneurs. I founded the US team at Kiva back in 2011 and then led that for 7 years. So Kiva is a great crowdfunding option, and it's microloans because lenders are only, the max they can get paid back is the principal. As a borrower, small business owner, you pay no interest and no fees. It's very, very cheap capital, but that then means that the amount you can raise is limited because if you're not offering a rate of return to investors, the amount of capital that you're able to raise is going to be limited. That's the same with GoFundMe, right? So you can raise GoFundMe donations for your business, non-dilutive capital, it's free money, but there's very few businesses that I'm going to donate to, right? Might donate to a nonprofit, but not really my local restaurant. Even in COVID, my favorite pizza restaurant in San Francisco ran a GoFundMe campaign to pay the salaries of their employees. It's like if they'd done a WeFunder loan with a small interest rate, I might have loaned them like $500, but I couldn't bring myself to donate even $25. It was like, I don't want to donate to this restaurant. So, but that's GoFundMe. You can sometimes raise smaller amounts of capital there. And then you have Kickstarter and Indiegogo, which is like perks-based crowdfunding, right? So that's where you're offering a product, usually at a discount. Oftentimes it's pre-sales, so it's a product you haven't launched yet, and you've raised the money to then build or make the product and then roll it out. So it's also non-dilutive. It's basically revenue. It's a great option. But again, because you're not really offering a return to investors, the amounts are usually more limited. So I think the average Kickstarter project is about 25K, for example. So less than 10% of the average WeFunder project. Although obviously there are Kickstarter campaigns, if they really take off and go viral, that can raise 7 figures and more. So that's kind of 0% interest loan crowdfunding with Kiva, donations crowdfunding with GoFundMe, perks-based, rewards-based crowdfunding with Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and then WeFunder is investment crowdfunding. So that's where investors are looking to make a return from investing in your business. Either they're going to make you a loan with an interest rate, or they're investing in equity in your company, just as any angel investor would, right? Imagine a world where WeFunder doesn't exist. You're going to, pitch angel investors on investing in your company. Exactly the same model. The investors get paid out in the same way. We just take that, and you can still raise from those accredited investors in your WeFunder campaign, but now you can also publicly promote it, raise from unaccredited investors, and raise money from the WeFunder community as well.
Thank you. And when we have that wonderful spectrum of crowdfunding and looking at your organization, how would you set yourself up for success on that? Are there certain milestones that should be reached before considering WeFunder, or when should we start this thought process as a business owner?
Yeah, no, we have actually a pretty wide spectrum of companies that we work with. So the smallest raises we do is about $50,000. So pretty early stage, all the way up to the SEC. Actually is topical because the SEC just on Monday, the day before the election, basically increased the amount that a company can raise using this investment crowdfunding model of regulation crowdfunding. Previously, it was 1.07 million per year. It's now 5 million per year. And so our range now is 50K to 5 million. So a company raising capital in that range can be a good fit for WeFunder. And then I think an important question is, do you have a business where you can raise some capital? Because one thing to be clear, especially with WeFunder, I think Kiva, about 80% of the money comes from the Kiva lender base. With WeFunder, it's about 1/3 comes from the WeFunder investor base on average. So if you want to raise 60K for your coffee shop, you probably have to bring 40K, right? and then we might bring 20K on average. If you want to raise, $3 million for your B2B SaaS startup, you might have to bring 2 million and we bring 1 million on an average campaign. And so then the question is, as that coffee shop owner, can you shake a few trees, hit people up that like customers, friends, family, can you hustle and make it happen and raise 40K? And if so, we'll kind of help you to accelerate. And just to be explicit as well, is like, I think we also make it easier for you to raise the 40K, because maybe if you're just talking to accredited investors locally in Reno, you're kind of struggling and you're getting to 10, 15K. But now if we give you this platform, this website, you can then promote it on your LinkedIn and get a local article about you in the paper about how this is the first company in Reno that's running an investment crowdfunding campaign. Then those things actually help you to raise more money from your network, and then we'll add a little bit from our network as well. So yeah, as you can see, it's all about just trying to make it easier for startups to raise capital.
Wonderful. Thank you. Just like Mike, we could probably talk about this for hours, but I'm going to pause, and I'd like to move over to Danielle to talk a little bit about venture capital. So we're going through a couple of these phases and stages, if you will, and I'm moving my screen so I can see you, Danielle.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. So my first question when we're thinking about venture capital is, when in the company growth process should I even think about this thing called venture capital? We've now heard two other different approaches. Where in that type of spectrum would venture capital fit?
I think it's appropriate to start thinking about this at the beginning, before you even form your legal entity. So as you were talking before about, do I want to grow with patient capital as a zebra, or do I want to kind of grow as quickly as possible? All that ties into whether you structure as an LLC, or if you're, a sole proprietor or a corporation. And in general, most traditional VC venture capital funds prefer to invest in Delaware C corporations. And that's not because Delaware's the best place in the world to live. Most of those corporations aren't actually in Delaware. It's just that it's a very business-friendly state, and their case law is well known, and so investors are familiar with their rules. So.
Wonderful, thank you. When we think about venture capital, you said we're starting even before we form the company. In terms of funds, are all funds the same? Like, can I just pick up the phone and call any fund I see listed on a website? Or are they
Great
different?
question. They're absolutely different. It's very important to do your research so that you're not wasting your time or theirs. Funds have different investment theses, and they also invest at different stages. So if I could talk a little bit about the three local funds that we have in the Northern Nevada region that all invest in startups. The Reno Seed Fund invests in seed stage companies that are post-revenue. And so they have specific industries that they invest in. That's mainly in the technology side. So they invest in SaaS and fintech and blockchain and IoT and a host of other things. And so if you're not at that stage or you're not in that industry, there's no reason to reach out to them. The second fund I want to mention is Fund NV, which is a pre-seed accelerator fund. So they invest in companies that are part of their accelerator program, Startup NV. And they specifically state on their website, so doing your homework, that they will invest up to $50K per company. And they do that through a convertible note that is with fixed non-negotiable terms. So if you are raising on a different instrument and you're not part of their program, it's not worth reaching out to them at this time for funding. The Audacity Fund Reno, which Kelly and I both represent, we are representing the Northern Nevada region. We're a pre-seed proof of concept fund. So what that means is that we will fund an idea on a napkin. So you don't have to have your legal entity determined yet. So in general, we are industry agnostic. So we will invest in any company. We invest in both Main Street companies as well as high-tech, high-growth companies. And we are focused on investing in appropriate capital. And so we'll invest up to $50K in a company, but what the appropriate capital means is that unlike these traditional venture capital funds, we want to fit the needs, growth, and the strategies of the company themselves. So we're open to investing in actually all of the instruments that you, Kelly, spoke about at the beginning, as far as standard debt and equity, convertible instruments, as well as alternative debt and equity. And we can also do grants.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview and the spectrum from very, very small idea on a napkin and as you grow the different stages, and also for that reference that clearly if you want to go the venture capital route, you need to do some homework and some digging into each of the funds that will be the most appropriate for you. I know a common question that usually comes up around venture capital that I wanted to make sure was brought to this presentation today is, how much does a venture capitalist take of my company? Most founders want to know that off the bat. Is there a standard amount that venture capitalists take?
So it absolutely depends on your instruments. So some of these instruments that you can raise money on are pro-investor. So they're the investor or the VC firm is setting the terms. And there are other instruments that are more pro-company. And these kind of newer alternative instruments are kind of win-win for both. So on average, at the time of an IPO, about 50% of the ownership of a company is owned by venture capital firms. So it's very important that entrepreneurs are cautious and aware of how much ownership of their company they are giving away. That's a key thing to be looking out for, because on average, half of the company is owned by VC when there's an exit.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I am going to pause this again. We can talk about venture capital all day, but I'd like to have all of us talk about a few different items. One is with all of these different approaches, we all know that unfortunately, as we're building companies, there's some common mistakes. So I wanted just to open it up to our panelists in terms of what are some common mistakes that you've seen when people that you look at them and go, oh, I wish they wouldn't have done this when they started, or if they just would have done XYZ, then this would be so much better. So again, what are some of the common mistakes that you'd love to be able to share?
I can chat. This is kind of a more general thing as opposed to specific to investment crowdfunding, but I think I've seen just so many entrepreneurs have this very common problem that they're trying to raise capital kind of too soon, or it's like they could be spending their time on iterating on the product and building something people want, as Y Combinator talks about, and they could be making more progress without raising capital. And I think many founders are like, oh, I need to raise capital to do this thing. It's like, no, you can oftentimes do more and go further, by bootstrapping than you might think. And then obviously, if you're trying to raise capital before you have the right metrics or the traction, or you've kind of validated that there's demand from customers, et cetera, then it's just going to be harder for you to raise capital. And so you're going to spin your wheels and like have all these meetings, and it's just going to be really hard for you to raise. So I think, just talking to founders that have trodden that path before. Ooh, light went out on me there. Clearly the building doesn't agree with what I'm saying here. But, speaking with founders that have trodden that path before and getting their wisdom on, okay, is now a good time for you to raise capital, or should you be trying to focus on keeping on iterating on the product and getting the growth going?
And I would just build quickly on that too, in the sense that a lot of the character-based lending that I've been doing over the last half a dozen years or so have been to startups, and many times startups are a little premature. They might sign a lease before they really know what they're doing, which is disastrous. They might engage with one of these online fintech type companies who charges them 50% or 100% interest rate. They might get themselves into a lot of trouble. So I do encourage people, again, it's important that you take advantage of the resources that might be available in your community, whether that's a small business development center or a women's business resource center, or many of the other resources that are out there. Talk to as many people as you can, attend Startup Week events, just learn as much as you can from your peers or future peers before you really pull the trigger, if I can use that expression. It's just being careful and thinking things through. Common sense, if I can suggest that. But
I would just add to that I see a lot of startups founded by women and by underrepresented founders where they have been seduced by the sexy Silicon Valley, terms, and so they're using convertible notes to raise money for their startups, which are not tech companies and are likely not on the unicorn path, which makes it challenging for the investors to get an exit as well, to get their return back. So I think taking the time and really working with advisors and finding a good attorney and finding good consultants to work with you on determining what the best instrument is.
One more example with respect to crowdfunding specifically. I think a mistake I've seen founders make with crowdfunding is kind of thinking that it's going to be really easy and you just launch a campaign and then watch the money roll in. And whichever platform you use, even Kiva, I think Kiva probably makes it the most easy. The majority of money is coming from Kiva lenders. But whatever platform you use, you do need to work, you do need to hustle, you do need to run a marketing campaign. So kind of see it as work. And just as if you're trying to raise money in a Regulation D round from accredited investors, you're taking a bunch of meetings. I chatted with a YC alumni company, right? Like went through Y Combinator the other day, and he's told me it took him 100 meetings with angels to get the first check. And so, you've got to bring that level of kind of effort and hustle and creativity to make the campaign work. And I think we make it easier than if you're trying to only raise from accredited investors privately, but it's still really, really hard work.
Thank you all for those phenomenal insights. And we have a question from a participant. How important is a good advisory board when seeking funding? And I think across each of these different instruments would definitely be a great conversation.
I'll go ahead and start. In venture capital, particularly in the early stages and the pre-seed and seed funding, before the Series A, looking at the team is what's most important. And so a lot of advice is that if you're a solo founder, you may want to consider having a co-founder. Another way to grow your team is to have that advisory board. And so it would be important, I would say, at that point to have folks who have the backgrounds and skill sets and strengths that you as an individual don't have to round that all out.
I would say that there are hundreds of things that any investor will look at, whether that investor be investing $100 on WeFunder or $100,000 as a fund. And as Danielle mentioned, kind of team and founders, I think is maybe the number one, but kind of growth and market and kind of so many things. But for me, kind of advisory board, I'm not really normally looking at that. I think it probably kind of comes from is like relatively less important versus a lot of other things. But obviously, it's one factor, and if you have an awesome advisory board, that's a plus point for sure.
And I would just add too that, from a traditional lender's perspective, it's probably not a very big deal, but character-based lending is very analogous to VC lending, just at the other end of the scale. So having a team is very important, and the team couldn't be part of that advisory board, can be part of that if it's a very small founder or co-founder type situation. And then for us, at least to the high touch program, having a network, and the network could be something you build through one of these groups. So from a traditional lender, not a big deal, but from a character-based lender, very similar to what Danielle and Jonny have said.
Great, thank you. And to everyone, please, if you have questions, if you'd like to ask your question, that's great, or put it in the chat. And I have a long list of questions for our wonderful panelists, so I'll continue on unless I see a chat or someone just jumps in. My next question for everyone is, we'd love to hear a company's success that is just one of your exciting things to talk about in the type of funding that you focus on. Jonny, should we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just actually bringing up this example. I'll put it in the chat window here. This is not an endorsement at all, but just an interesting example of a company that's live on WeFunder right now. So they've currently raised, they've been live for a few weeks, I think now. They've raised $71,000 from 25 investors. And it's Bay Area Ranchers Cooperative. They're doing, as you can see, responsible meat processing in the Bay Area. You can, and I would really encourage you guys to check it out. You can watch the video. They list a bunch of reasons for why you might consider investing in them. You can, again, read their team, see that some of the press they've got, read their pitch deck. So there's a lot of information that's on their page, and a really good example of a company in the agriculture space that's running a pretty good campaign on WeFunder right now.
Wonderful, thank you, Jonny.
I have a, oh, sorry, Mike. I have an example locally here in Reno. It's a female-founded company called Panty Drop. Many of you may know Julie Arsenault, and her company is an underwear subscription service for women, and it involves a technology component, and it's kind of like a subscription box the way that a Stitch Fix would be, but it's for underwear for women. And they are, a local company that has done well and has raised capital and is part of the Reno Seed Fund currently. So they're continuing to grow during COVID, and we're very proud of all of Julie's successes.
Thank you.
Let me add one. I'll share a website on, whoops, I sent it to just to one person. So I've had the chance to work with a few different companies over the years, but one of the ones that I really enjoyed working with most was a company called Vortec Watches. It was 3 young kids out of college in Penn State, actually moved to Colorado, and their business model was to take the old pocket watches, which the US was the center for watch production up to World War II, take those old heirloom watches, buy them at sales and stuff, and restore them and refurbish them and turn them into wristwatches. That sort of morphed from that into doing 3D printing to create titanium bezels for the watches. We provided a character-based loan to them to help them actually get started with a Kickstarter campaign. They were quite successful with that. That then grew into the opportunity to get some more traditional type financing using the SBA through the Community Advantage program, which grew into the opportunity to work with more traditional bank financing. They created some investors as part of their capital stack along the way. And now after like 5 or 6 years, they're pretty much ready to buy a building and invest in their community. The fun thing for those of you to realize, this is a fairly innocuous business, but because they were refurbishing watches from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, one of those brands was Hamilton, which was a brand that was bought by Swatch in Switzerland. So Swatch decided to go after them in federal court to cease and desist from their services of restoring and rebuilding restoring watches. So that dragged on for like 5 or 6 years. So I say that in the sense that this is a very successful company, but it hasn't been very easy for them dealing with the giant that is Swatch. So for any of you out there, don't buy any Swatch products. And if you want to buy an American-made watch, go and visit Vortec in northern Colorado.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions that are coming up, and one that just popped up is, where would I get connected up with Emerging Small Business Program, the ESB? Did any of us talk about that today?
Hi, Kelly. This is Patty from GoEd.
Hi.
The ESB program is actually a program that we have within the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And I would be happy to get that information in the chat here so folks can sign up for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patty. There are also are a couple of questions I'm just going to actually answer really quickly. One is that Audacity Fund mentioned that there's grants and what are the requirements for that. The Audacity fund, in terms of grants, again, we're appropriate capital. So if it seems appropriate for the company that a grant would actually be the best for their needs, then that is an option as we discuss different funding approaches for that specific company. Generally speaking, grants usually fall when you're on that idea on a napkin phase, where just a small amount would be really helpful. So that's generally where those are. The Audacity Institute, we are a hybrid organization, has actually been administering City of Reno grants as well, but that is a separate program. And if anyone would like to hear about that, just let us know. Then there also was a very specific question that was about the venture capital route and looking at how the instruments go together, generally speaking about someone who has a convertible note, and when do you go and raise on a priced round or an actual standard equity in terms of what we reviewed today. It's very company specific. However, generally speaking, you have one convertible and then you move on to an equity round. Sometimes, as we know, things don't go as planned, so there might be 2 rounds on the convertibles, and then you move on to an equity or priced round, but it really, again, is company specific. And we are getting very near our time, and just wanted to close out with parting words of wisdom from each of our panelists. How about Jonny? Shall we start with you? You're closest on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure about wisdom, but I was joking with Mike in the private chat. I'm a big fan of shameless self-promotion. So, you know, if any of you guys want to become an angel investor today, you can do that for $100 on WeFunder in 5 minutes. It's really fun to invest in startups, and we made it really easy and cheap. So check that out. And then the other thing is, if you are a founder looking at raising 50K to 5 million, I would encourage you to consider investment crowdfunding as one option. You might not think it's the right fit for you. One downside, like, you have to make your financials public. So some founders, for whatever reason, are not comfortable with transparency. Like I mentioned, it's hard work, as most fundraising is. But I think it's definitely something you should consider alongside more conventional forms of fundraising. And I'll put my email in the chat if anyone wants to talk more about it. Then would love to do that.
And let me add, I'm not sure I have any wisdom, but I am old. But other than that, I would suggest that from the perspective of businesses, again, we've presented a bunch of different options here. Many businesses will get started and grow with the combination of them, what's called a capital stack. So it might be your money that gets started. It might be a little bit of debt or a little bit more equity. It might be some more debt, some more equity, and you'll grow the stack like that. I would also suggest that for many of your businesses that are young, really, businesses that do have mentors tend to do much better than businesses that don't. So if there's a business in a neighboring county or a neighboring state, or just someone that you've heard about or read about, reach out to advice. We found here in Colorado with the Denver Startup Week, which is now the largest organically grown startup week in the nation, entrepreneurs are very happy to pay forward. They'll always give you advice and guidance. So reach out. You don't have to do it on your own. In fact, if you try, you may not be very successful. So look at all of these resources here, but there are plenty of others as well too.
And for my final parting words, I would say that Audacity, we really believe in supporting the entrepreneurs to trust their own intuition. So listen to your gut. And if you are seeking to raise money on your own terms, trust that the right investors are out there and that you'll be able to find them. Don't let someone else convince you to do it their way or to get strong-armed into doing something that doesn't feel right for you.
Well, thank you all very much, panelists, for your wonderful insights. And thank you again to the team for putting together this wonderful event.
And thank you, Kelly, and your team again. This was a wonderful exercise in ways that there are possibilities of receiving funding.